Okay, so we're continuing on Daf Chof Tes on the days. We started with the Mishnah a couple of weeks ago or last week. If someone finds Sfarim, books, how do you return books to, how do you protect them or return them, among other things and other items other than books, clothing and other things. So the Mishnah gave us a sort of a pathway on what you do. And we started the Gemara talking about how if you have a Sefer Torah or other Sfarim at the time, you have to roll them to keep them fresh so that they shouldn't decay. But you can't sell them. And it's interesting what the Gemara said last week, in contrast to Tefillin, which if you find Tefillin, you sell right away. Sfarim you don't, because Sfarim were more precious in the sense that they were more difficult to obtain. Not that they're more choshuv, but there was a big tefillin maker at the time, just like we have tefillin makers today. There was a big tefillin maker who would make tefillin all the time, so there would never be a problem in replacing tefillin. But Sfarim, were very hard. There was no real printing presses or things of that nature. It was all in writing, so it's much harder to preserve a sefer, which is why you don't sell the sefer. You try to maintain it in the event that, in fact, you can find it. You can find the owner and give it back to him. So that was a very big issue for us as well. How we saw that in contrast. So we are. If you take a look in the middle of the page, there's two dots. And we started that sugya of Sefer Torah, why we selected a Sefer Torah as opposed to other Sfarim, for example. And the Gemara tells us, because I would have thought by Sefer Torah we're more lenient because it's a mitzvah for people to read from the Sefer Torah. Therefore, you would be able to, a shoel, someone who borrows it can lend it to someone else, or someone who hires it for money can actually sublease it. Says the Gemara, no, you cannot. That when you find a sefer, you have to be the one to protect the sefer, and it can't pass to other hands in the same way with a subtenant, so to speak. You can't turn around, even if it's for a mitzvah, because Sefer Torah is a mitzvah to read. Still, you can't do it. That's how careful we have to be with Sefer Torah and with other books. So we're now in those last four words of the line, Poscha v'korobo, Pshita, about 4 lines below the dots, the 2 dots. Right. Okay. So the Mishnah says, or actually the Brisa says, we have a Brisa here that says, Hamafkid Sefer Torah etzel chavero, if someone gives a Sefer Torah to hold as a possession, like a Shomar Chinam, then he has to go lo kol shnei mosar chodesh upascha v'korabo. So that's the Brisa. In other words, you roll it every 12 months. You can open and read from it. Says the Gemara, pascha v'korabo, pshita. Of course you can read from it. Why did he borrow it? If the whole purpose, the Gemara tells us, by a shoel. First a shoel, then a shomar chinam. It says hashoel sefer Torah machavera, havazil shalena la'acher, and but he can open and read it. What's the whole point of him borrowing it if not to read it? So what's the chiddush of the Gemara when the Gemara says poscha v'korabo? He can open and read from it. Pshita, of course. Why did he borrow it? So the Gemara asks a very simple but straightforward question. What's going on here? You're telling me at the end of the Brisa that he can open and read it. And so the Gemara says, what else would he do with it if he borrowed it? He didn't borrow it just to keep it on the shelf and look at it. Says the Gemara, no, that you're right. Of course he can read it. But Seifa Ichbechale, we need to say these words in order to understand the Seifa, the second half of the Brisa, that someone should not learn from it, make a laning. Like in other words, open it for the first time to learn something from it, whereby you would be so engrossed in the learning that you might pull it or tug it or do something that could harm it. So in other words, what the Gemara is telling us, it's setting us up. It's telling us that in contrast to rolling the Sefer Torah and then looking at it and reading from it, you cannot learn from it for the first time. So in other words, it's kind of a two-part thing. First, you have to tell us that of course you can read, you can read from it. So all you're doing is reading. You're not doing anything but reading, but you can't learn from it if it's the first learning. If it's not the first learning, then we're a little bit more lenient because you already know the Gemara, so you're not going to, presumably, you're not going to, pull it and push it and slap it and do everything else. But if you're doing it for the first time, then you kind of lose your sense of it, and you could possibly damage it. That's the theory of the Gemara, why it says posach v'korabo, in order to set up the sefer that you can't. The same as when someone gives it as a pikadon, meaning like a shomer chinam. Gololo says the Brisa, kol shnei mosach chodesh. You have to roll it once every 12 months. Poscha v'korabo, and also it uses the words poscha v'korabo, that you can open and you can read it. Now here by hamafkid, it's not the same. If you borrow the Sefer Torah, what else would you borrow it for if not to learn it? I mean, it's not window dressing. But here, hamafkid means that it was given to you as a pikadon. You're supposed to hold it in possession for someone else. So poscha v'korabo, says the Gemara, or the Brisa, the poscha v'korabo, maya vidite. What did he do that he should open it up? In other words, what business does he have reading? Frank the Gemara. In the case of a mafkid, where it was given to him just as a hold, not as a borrow where he can presumably use it. Says the Gemara, Maya Vidite. What's he doing here? What business does he have to open it up and reach it? It's not his. Besu, and further, Imbishvilo Pascha Asar. You're telling me that if he opened it up for his own benefit, because the Mishnah tells us that you can do things for the benefit of the article, but not for your own personal pleasure. So in Bishvilo Pascha, if he opens it up for his own pleasure, Asar, Ba'amr Pascha v'korabo. The Brisa says Pascha v'korabo without limitation. It just says the words posach v'korabo. And yet, if you do it for your own personal pleasure, it's not permissible. So how do we reconcile the language? This is about the language of the Brisa. Because the language, what bothers the Gemara here is, it says posach v'korabo, you can open and read from it. So the Gemara has certain questions. First by Hashoel, when you borrow it, and now by Hamafkid, how do you reconcile the words poscha v'korabo with the rest of the Gemara? So in the case of Hashoel, where we say poscha v'korabo, of course you can open and read it. That was the purpose, but it was for the purpose of the Sefer, not to learn from it. In other words, to start pulling it and tugging it. In the case of Hamafkid, where all you're doing is guarding it, what business do you have opening of the book? Someone gave you a book to a Sefer, let's say a Sefer Torah, and it was rolled. You have one responsibility. You got to roll it once every 12 months. Make sure that the air gets in it, that it doesn't start falling apart or get decayed or whatever might happen to a scroll. And that's all you have to do. The rest of the time, you just leave it on the shelf and don't do anything. Where do you come to start opening it and looking at it and reading it? So this is, and furthermore, it says poscha v'korabo, that you can open it. So that's a stira in itself. You're telling me that you shouldn't be able to do it by hamafkid, but the Brisa says beferish poscha v'korabo. So these are the questions that the Gemara is asking from the language of the Brisa. It doesn't seem to hold together.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
When if you're finding a Sefer Torah, wouldn't it be okay naturally to, wherever it's rolled to, you'd want to open it up and make sure nothing was damaged, no rain got on it or anything? It doesn't mean you have to open it all the way up and start going left and right, but the basic checking the status where it was opened and found that way would be normal to me.
And the Gemara is saying that that's okay. Opening it just to check it is okay, but poscha v'korabo means you start reading in it. You start actually Vayom Hashem al Shalemar, and you start doing something more than just checking to see that it's not damaged. That's what the Gemara is objecting to.
Somebody might start reading to make sure each letter wasn't damaged. You know, a sofer would probably do that more than the average person.
Right.
But if you're intellectually attending to it, you're getting the value that you're not supposed to get. That's
because you're actually learning from it, because you're actually right. So in other words, the Gemara is confused. Not the Gemara. The Gemara is saying it's confusing because on the one hand, you're supposed to just roll it and not do anything else with it, because otherwise, see, the fine line between what's good for the sefer and what's good for you is what the Mishnah last week told us. And that's a fine line that you have to sort of, in your own mind, be the judge of. Where does the benefit to the sefer end and the benefit to you begin? In other words, you're not supposed to have benefit from it. What does that mean? If I'm rolling it and at the same time I'm looking at it, I'm not really doing it for my benefit. I'm doing it for the benefit of the Torah. But if I'm just rolling it and then I'm going to start learning in it and understand what the pshat and the pasuk is, that's already crossing the line to me. And the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to do it for your own benefit. So this is the fine line that the Gemara is asking. So where do you come to read from it? It's not yours. So the Gemara says hachikama. Okay, this is the explanation. In kishu golala pascha b'karabo, if while he is rolling it for the benefit of the Sefer Torah, poseach b'karabo, he opens it up and reads from it, mutter. That's okay. You can actually read from it, koreh, if you're doing it initially for the benefit of the Torah. In bishvilo pascha asr. But if he has no reason to open it for the benefit of the Torah, because he already did it a month ago, 2 months ago, and one day he says, you know what, I'd like to look into this sefer, and he opens it up and he reads from it, then that's shot in the brisa, usher, it's forbidden because he's doing it for his own benefit. So in other words,
Rabbi, one other question. I'm a little confused here. When somebody writes a Sefer Torah, even under commission, isn't it implied that anybody else can look at it and read it? It isn't a personal thing that nobody else can use. It's a Sefer, and the intention is that not just one person is allowed to have any benefit from it.
Hey,
if it was a different kind of object, is a different kind of story, a lawnmower or whatever it is. But a Sefer Torah is written for the purpose of people to look at it, learn a little bit from it. It doesn't hurt the Sefer Torah in any way. It doesn't detract from the value if somebody starts rolling in and looking at more of the Sedra. He wants to see his Haftorah Sedra or something.
But you're rationalizing. It's a slippery slope, and then he wants to take it to his own area of the Beis HaMedrash, and it's a slippery slope. And you did not go to the yeshiva I went to in the years that I went, when the words makpid gamur, do not touch, were very much written in.
But again, I think what you're hitting on is very important, because the question here is, and by the way, we're talking not necessarily where a Sefer Torah is being written and someone is looking at it. We're talking about where you find a Sefer Torah, so finding has a different connotation than maybe just writing and reviewing it while you write it. But let's put that aside. So we're talking about a finding of the Sefer Torah, and we've discussed this many, many times. What's the balance? What's the balance between preserving something that is lost for its original owner and doing the right thing, let's say, by the find itself? So that's the balance we're always. You're right, Jay. There's nothing wrong with people learning and poring over a Sefer Torah. That's what it's there for. But we concluded last week's Gemara by saying that the reason why this sugya is talking about a Sefer Torah and not any other book that is rolled is because the Chayra, a Sefer Torah, like you say, is something that everybody would want to read from or needs to hear from. Nevertheless, the conclusion is you're not allowed to. So in other words, it's a balancing test, and you're right. You're saying everybody should benefit from it because it's a Sefer Torah and everybody has to hear it and it's a good thing. And the Gemara says that when you find a Torah or find this Sefer, that you can't. You can't. Why? Because you're preserving the book for the original owner. And the more people will look at it, the more chance is it will be damaged or torn or ripped. And that's something that a finder has to protect. He has an obligation to protect the book for the owner, even if it's something that everybody says, oh, let me have a look. It's important for me to see the Sefer Torah, but he's still the shaliach, so to speak, of the owner. And that's where we run into this issue. I know it's a little bit of a...
No, it makes sense, actually. It's very true that the owner probably would welcome people looking at it and learning from it. But what if, God forbid, something happens to it? Then
Right.
it's your responsibility.
And it's a responsibility. So that's the balancing test that the Gemara tells us. And at the end of the day, the Gemara really tries to compromise and say that, you can have a peek at it if you're already rolling it and doing things for it, but you can't just open it for the purpose of just reading it yourself without there being some benefit to the book. So that's how the Gemara ends the discussion. But it is a bit of a question, and you're right, Jay. In theory, you would think that a Sefer Torah or a book of importance should be shared. That's true if it's yours. If it's yours, share it with anybody you want. But if you're finding it and it belongs to somebody else, and you're just the shaliach to be able to return it to him, then you have certain obligations which do not allow you to just open it up to anybody. And that's sort of the balancing test that the Gemara comes away with.
So are there other cases of a shoel where no hana confers with the object itself? Are there any other cases?
No, a shoel is a fakir. A shoel, when a person borrows the object, he borrows it for the purpose of using it. In other words, the difference here between hamafkid, which is basically you're a guardian, and a shoel, where you're borrowing it for the purposes of using it, means that if you're borrowing it for the purpose of using it, of course you could read from it because that's why you borrowed it. But if
Right.
you're a guardian, someone says, do me a favor, just watch this Sefer Torah for me, then you have no business looking at it because all you're supposed to do is watch it. You're not supposed to read from it. So the difference is between whether you're tasked with the obligation of just watching or whether you yourself are a shoel and you're borrowing it for the purpose of reading it. Otherwise, why would I borrow it? I'm not going to borrow it just to put it on my mantle and make it look nice.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's how the Gemara concludes this thing, and that now we can just the rest of this is just sort of cleanup. Sumchus Omer, as a practical matter, when do you roll? How do you roll? Sumchus Omer b'chodosh, a new Sefer Torah Shloshim Yom. It's new, so you have to break it in. You do it every 30 days. The Yashon Shnei Moshe Chodesh. An older Sefer Torah that's already been around, you only have to roll it once every 12 months. A new one, you have to sort of break it in the more. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Echad Zeh v'Echad Zeh Shnei Moshe Chodesh. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says no difference between new and old. It's 12 months. Correct. The Gemara of Yaakov ben Yaakov Hainu Tanakama. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is the Tanakama because the Brisa says in the very beginning, without naming a name, which means it's the Tanakama, that you do it once every 12 months. So the Gemara does not. If a Tana says something, and then another Tana comes and wants to say the same thing, we don't quote him because it's already been said. That's the practice of the Gemara. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is telling us once every 12 months. Correct the Gemara, that's the Tanakama. The Tanakama is Rabbi Meir usually. So if Rabbi Meir already said it, what is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov coming to be Mechadish when he says once in 12 months? We already know that from the Tanakama. And so the Gemara, it's a mistake. Ela Emer, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Omer, Echad Zeh v'Echad Zeh Shloshim Yom. He didn't mean to say once every 12 months. He meant to say once every 30 days. In any event, there were differing opinions as to how frequently you should roll in order to preserve it. Some say every 30 days, some say it should be longer, but be that as it may, clearly, depending which sheet do you follow, you have to do it in order to keep it fresh. And that's one of the obligations. In other words, someone who finds it can't just say, I'm going to put it on my shelf, and if it takes 5 years to find the owner, that's good. And I'll just leave it on the shelf for 5 years. Can't do it because then by then it may decay or spoil, and then you will not have fulfilled the mitzvah Hoshev Teshiva. Okay.
Rabbi Grauman,
Yeah,
can we impute from this that you also have to apply common sense things to contemporary situations? You find someone's iPhone somewhere on Arcola Avenue, and you're doing your best advertising to try and find the owner. If you leave this thing for years, the battery will degrade. So if you're able to charge it occasionally to keep it in good working order, you do things like, do you impute contemporary things from this, that you just have to use
well, I mean, again, yeah. So typically, you would be right that with new technology and other things, it poses different challenges in terms of the halacha, and you take the halacha and you try to sort of impute, as you say.
Do I try, or is it someone above my pay grade, or do we just have to use common sense generally and leave it at that?
I think you use common sense generally, but if you are in a pickle and you don't know what to do, you ask a shaila and say, listen, I have this thing. I know it's not going to be returned right away. What should I do? But common sense always has a place in all of this, because a lot of these things can be, we can figure it out. We can.
Right, but so the corollary to that though would be that yes, you should plug it in every so often so it keeps a charge. But the flip side is that you'd be allowed to turn it on to try to see if you can figure out something about who the owner is,
Right.
but you wouldn't be allowed to then go and use it as an extra tool to browse the internet.
Right. So similar to the Sefer Torah, that incidental hana is acceptable, but not purposeful hana.
It should be used for the benefit of the object, not for your benefit.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so take a look at Rashi. The Rashi, middle of the page, Maya Vidite Gabe. Remember, we said that when he rolled it, what business does he have? The Havamina here was that you were going to do it for your own purpose, for Lola Tzorach Sefer Torah. In other words, you were going to open it for your benefit. The whole Tzorach Sefer Torah, Tonale Gololo Kol Shnei Mosar Chodesh. We already said you roll it every 12 months. Tonale Gola Kol Shnei Mosar Chodesh Lahochi Parchinan Maya Vidite. What's he doing opening it up? The Hagabi Sefer Torah Likras Bo Tzorach Atzmo, because it seems that he's reading it for himself, and that's forbidden. So the Gemara is explaining what the kasha is Maya Vidite when someone gave it. Let's say someone gave me Sefer Torah just to guard, not to read. And I open it up, the Korabo, Maya Vidite, what am I doing? I have no business opening it up and reading the Sefer Torah. It's like the you find the iPhone and now I want to open up and I want to scroll into it and I want to see what's going on. You can't do that. Inkishu Gololo Lahano Sefer Torah, Pascha the Korabo, Mutter. If you do it for the Sefer Torah and then you open it up, then it's mutter for you to read. The new one will sort of disintegrate or become damaged more than an old one. So a new one has to be sort of broken in, is what he's saying. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, and in other words, there's no difference in the end, in the maskana, there's no difference, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, between new and old. Everything is once in 30 days. So that's how we reconcile it, and it's not a masla.
Lahavdil, it's like a brand new baseball glove. You got to break it in.
That's exactly right. You got to oil it, you got to keep the ball in, and you got to do all of those things to keep it. Very good.
But actually, it might be more similar than just break it in, because they're actually both, in a sense, a form of leather. I mean, it's I was actually there, and now you mentioned the baseball glove. It's that so similarly with the cloth, despite all the preparation that is done to turn this animal skin into parchment that you can write on, the reality is there's probably still a chemical process of it drying out and seasoning and so on, and possibly, in a certain sense, very similar to the baseball glove.
Yeah, well, I mean, leather will dry if you don't moisten it or do something to it. Parchment, on the other hand, according to this, if you just leave it and don't touch it for a long period of time, may have a tendency to start falling apart. Therefore, the usage is what keeps it vibrant, so to speak.
Rav Malka told me the same thing many years ago, that a
Oh, did he?
Sefer
Okay.
Torah likes to be used for that.
Likes to be, yeah, it makes sense. Okay, says the Gemara weiter, you can't make a laning on it because otherwise you're going to just start schlepping it and pulling it in every direction. And you can't have two people who read at the same time. Frek the Gemara of Ramina, I'll ask a kasha from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Valikra Parsha V'yishna, you can't read the Parsha and review it. Valikra Bo Parshas V'yitargem, and you can't read from the Sefer Torah Parsha and be metargem, meaning translated. V'lo yifsach bo yosim megivol dafen, and you shouldn't open it more than three dafen, 3 paragraphs, 3 parsha, in other words, 3 sections, 3 sections. Lo yikrubo shlosha b'nei adam bekerach echad, and 3 people shouldn't look into one kerach, into one section to review. That's the brisa. Frek the Gemara or Shnaim Korin, but 2 can. We say here in the Mishnah 2 people shouldn't look at it at the same time. The Chayra from that brisa, it says 3 shouldn't, but if 3 shouldn't, then 2 can. If 2 can, then it's a stira on our brisa, on our Mishnah. That's the Ramina. That's the Gemara's kasha is from that brisa. We see that 3 people shouldn't look at it together. Our Mishnah says not even 2 people should look at it together. So comes Abaye and he says, "Lo kasha kan b'inyan echad kan b'shnei inyanim." Gives an interesting answer, and he says that by inyan echad, when you're learning one sugya, 2 people should not learn that same sugya together from this found Sefer Torah, because then you may have problems of schlepping and pulling and tearing. But Shnei Inyanim, if you opened up the Sefer and one person looked at one daf and another person looked at another daf, they weren't competing for the same portion, so there's no reason for one to pull it away from the other. He's reading from daf A, and he's reading from daf Beis or daf Gimel, whatever it happens to be. So that's how Abaye reconciled it. He says, truly, you shouldn't even have 2. But when can you have 2? When they're not competing with each other. Okay, so that's Abaye's teretz, and therefore it's not a stira from that brisa.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
when they're reading the Torah and the Bima, the reader is reading, and then the person who has the aliyah is following along. I mean, they're looking at the Torah at the same time.
Correct, but that's not a found Sefer Torah. In other words, we're dealing specifically with a Sefer Torah that someone found, where he has a responsibility to keep it intact. You're right. We do it all the time. Of course, we read from the Sefer Torah, and the person with the aliyah reads, and that's perfectly fine. But we're drawing a distinction between a regular Sefer Torah that we use all the time and one that's found, where you have a higher obligation of protecting the Sefer from not being damaged. And the Gemara is telling us that it's one thing to read, by the way, and it's another thing to learn. So if the Baal Koreh is reading and I'm just following, as we do when we have an aliyah, that shouldn't be a problem, because you're not really competing with the Baal Koreh. It's when you're competing, meaning you want to look at it and understand it, and I want to look at it and understand it. So I'm going to take a closer look at it. I'll pull it to me, and you'll want to pull it to you. It's the pulling and the tearing and the pushing that has the potential for damaging the Sefer. That is not allowed. But just reading alone is fine. It's fine. And also there is, of course, a difference between our Sefer Torah, which we own, meaning the shul or whoever gives permission, and a Sefer Torah that is found, where you have an obligation to preserve it for its owner and not allow someone else to possibly damage it. So there's a different standard of care. I mean, you always have to care for it, but there's a different standard that you have to use when you're protecting someone else's goods that that you don't have permission really to use. And the Sefer Torah that we use every Shabbos or during the week, where of course we're doing it with permission and l'shem the mitzvah. So there is a difference there.
Thank you. Okay, that's-
Okay, now the Mishnah went on, and now we went from Sfarim, we went to clothing. Now we started talking about clothing. What happens if you find like an expensive shirt or blouse or something like that? What do you do with that? How do you preserve that for the owner? Says the Mishnah, matzah kasos menara achad l'shloshim yom. That if you found a garment, then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to sort of shake it out once every 30 days to make sure that it's not I don't know what happens to clothing if you just fold it. Maybe it starts having lines and other things that you can't get out later. So basically, you just shake it out so that it looks and feels like it's new or preserved.
Well, you can also have problems, I think we've mentioned this before, with bugs and things, where if you get to it soon enough, it's no big deal, but if it sits for a long time.
Right,
it can do a
or
lot
maybe a
of damage.
moth gets into a sweater or something like that. Yeah, exactly. Fact the Gemara. So the Gemara has a kasha. Lememra, are you going to tell me Dinir Malale that shaking helps it? That's what it seems to be. Rabbi Yochanan says Mishi Yeshlo Garde Uman Besof Beso Yenar Kasusa B'chol Yom. This is kind of like a it's a euphemism. In other words, someone who has a weaver, someone who can sew, who lives in his house, he should shake the shirt every day, because even if he damages it, he has someone who can fix it. In other words, it's like saying that you're telling me shaking is good for it. Why is shaking good for it? The more you shake, the more you're going to rip it. So it's kind of like a reverse question. He's saying someone who has a weaver in his house, okay, you take, like, for instance, some people can sew, some people can't sew. A button falls off. Some people put it back on. Some people have the button off for 6 months because they don't know how to put it back on. So if you have someone who knows what to do, no problem. So he's saying, but you're telling me that shaking is going to make it good. We see that shaking can potentially do damage to the item. So he answers, okay, so he says, you're right. Every day shaking is not good because you're really going to damage it. But once in 30 days, because all you're going to do is shake out the cobwebs, and that's okay. Again, these are tidbits that the Gemara is sort of giving us a little bit of an instruction on a day-to-day basis what to do. Iboyis Ema, so Gemara says another distinction, lo kasha ha b'chad v'ha b'trei. One person shaking is okay, two people are not, because again, two people shaking might do it more damage. It's okay to do it with your hand, but not with a stick, because they used to take sticks and smack them against the items of clothing in order to, I guess, the flatten them or maybe for whatever reason they did it. And with a stick, it's more dangerous to rip it. And then finally, he says, there's a difference between wool and linen. Wool, you shouldn't shake so often because wool rips, but linen doesn't rip. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Rashi. The Pasha Achas and Korin, two people shouldn't read one Pasha. Korin. The lav also l'shmute bahade, because they won't come to rip, because each one is looking at a different paragraph. Mishi yesh lo gardi uman bebeso she iriglo talisas chadashim tamid. He can sew or he can weave every day. Yinak susa b'chol yom v'lamdenu derech eretz the near kashala. This is a reverse, that near is damaging. You're telling me that you should shake, but you see that if you shake all the time, then you're going to rip it. So he gives an answer and says, no, he doesn't mean that. He means that all the different answers that the Gemara gives, that you don't do it every day, you do it once in 30 days. Or b'chad ba'odam echad ein niro kora, one person shaking won't tear it. Shnayim ha'oksim b'shnei rishoyim menarim matchina also yosim midai v'koshala. But if two people hold on to it, then there's a chance, like shnayim oksim b'talis, and if two people are coming in, each one is tugging and pulling, you could have damage. The amra koshala shenimchas v'nikros. This is wool because it can tear more often. Okay, so now we've ended the Gemara for this Mishnah, and the Gemara now does what we have seen many times. Since we brought down from Rabbi Yochanan an interpretation, now the Gemara wants to give us other sayings from Rabbi Yochanan. Has nothing to do necessarily with our Gemara, but because we brought down Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara says now is a good opportunity to learn things that Rabbi Yochanan has taught us. So now we're going to start about half a dozen lines from the bottom, several things that Rabbi Yochanan taught us has nothing to do with the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan, Kisei the Charshin, v'lo Kisei the Poshru. Very interesting that, take a look at Rashi. Kisei the Charshin, Noach lishtos koshel machshefos. You rather drink from the cup of a witch, mikos shel mayim poshrin, than from a cup of lukewarm water. Now, where this comes from, I have no idea. But in other words, one should, if you have a choice, you rather drink a witch's brew than a cup of sort of poshrin warm water. But I need to in the middle of Rabbi Yochanan. This is what we've said. Since we're talking about Rabbi Yochanan, Bahalachas derech eretz nokatla hane shmaitza. We're talking about derech eretz now. What's appropriate? So the Gemara is going to give us several other sayings from Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan has this saying: rather drink from a witch's cup and not from a warm cup of water. Below omrim ela b'chli matches. Now here are the exclusions. We only say that you shouldn't do this if he does it in a metal vessel, less lamba, but if he does it in an earthen vessel, then this rule doesn't apply of drinking, rather drinking from a kosher machshefa. In other words, if he didn't, Rashi says shavitz is rusach. If he didn't heat it up to a high degree, in other words, it's just lukewarm water. I don't know if you take it, maybe they just had water sitting around, and that you shouldn't do. But if you cook it, and again, this we can understand this maybe from a potential of illness or disease, is that if you have water lying around, that water could somehow become polluted or become infested. But if you cook it, savitz, what are you doing? You're killing all the germs. Then, so this is even a health thing. He's saying warm water, just drinking warm water is not safe. It could potentially harm you. So rather drink from a witch's brew than drink something that's been sitting around that may have accumulated bugs or other things. But if you cook it, in other words, you're destroying the negative, then he says, if you cook it, then there's no problem. Also, less lamba. And Sivi, Rashi says, Kol davar shenos l'toch hamashke, or a savim or tavlin. Those you put in either grasses or other kinds of accoutrements that you put into the water, or ikri besamim, or even besamim per sivi. In other words, if you filter the water, or you put something in it that can maybe the grasses offset a bug or something, whatever it might be. In other words, in those days, those kinds of things would offset the danger of drinking warm water. Again, it's a saying of Rabbi Yochanan al derech eretz, how someone should protect himself and his health. And we see that that's probably true, because we know for a fact from other Gemaras that a person who leaves water overnight uncovered, you shouldn't drink it the next day. Why? Because we worry about machshef and other things that can happen to the water. So you're not supposed to drink the water. You're supposed to keep it covered. But in any event, warm water seemingly maybe can attract bugs or other things, and therefore you have to be careful.
Well, and might be also that again, but unless it's really cold or really cold day or really hot day, but it's a, you know, an ordinary day, 40, 50, 60 degrees, the temperature of if you're not sure how long this water's been sitting around, the temperature of it is going to give you a clue, because if it was fresh from the well, or, you know, within the last hour from the well or from a stream running water, which is considered safer,
Yeah.
then it's going to be still cold. But if it's been sitting around for a while, then it's going to warm up to room temperature.
And cooler water inhibits the growth of bacteria. So,
Right.
yeah.
So sometimes it's a cooler.
Right. Right. Okay. Now, and then weiter, we have another saying from Rabbi Yochanan that we learned on top of that. So he's giving us more. And he says, "V'omer Rabbi Yochanan," this is a very interesting Gemara. I always find this Gemara interesting. V'omer Rabbi Yochanan, "Mi shehaniach lo aviv mos harbe." If a person gets a big Yerusha, he gets a lot of money from his parents. V'rotza la'avdon, and he wants to. In other words, there was an old joke of how do you become a like a small millionaire? You start off being a big millionaire. In other words, you have a lot of money, now you have less money. So this is what the Gemara is telling us. If you have a lot of money, and you want to destroy your wealth, here's the roadmap. Okay, get ready. Here's the roadmap. Yilbash big day pishtan. You should wear fine linen clothing. Yishtamesh bechli zefuchis, and you should use only glassware. The yiska po'alim bal yeshiv imohem, and you should hire workers and not watch over them. So he's giving you 3 things that you can do if you want to just dissipate your money. This is what you should do. Says the Gemara. Bechli pishtan. What is bechli pishtan? Bechinta rumisa. Says Rashi. The neyim yekarim u'maherim lechalos. This is like. He says, Rumis is Rome. He says, like, it must have been the fashions of Rome that were very fine, but very fickle. So you buy all these fine fashions and then they all fall apart, or it's like what we have in modern times, that every year there's a new design. So you buy a fancy design, you pay a lot of money, and the next year it's obsolete because there's a new fancy design. So that's one way of spending your money quickly. The next one, he says, the Yishtamesh b'kli zfuchis Zogisa chiyursa. In other words, these are kinds of glass that are very, very delicate. So, you know, it seems like almost with every use, they can be destroyed. It's not like a hardy glass or a hardy plate or something that you can wash and use again and again. So if you want to spend your money, it's a one-time use only, but it's expensive. The yiska po'alim ba'al yeshivim mohem. And what's an example of hiring Paulim and not sitting? Says the Gemara says Targuma top of Lamed and Aleph, Beture the Nofish Poseidon. What does Rashi say? In other words, you're referring to people who are wagon drivers, or Beture is sheep, or not sheep, oxen. Now the oxen, they pull the carts. Says Rashi, the Nofish Poseidon, Sharov avodas karkol shalahem. Bishorim hoisa. It was with the ox, with oxen. Afcharishas hakramim, the plowing of the vineyards. B'tzirasa manhigim klei hamachresha ba'egla. We know this. You know, you affix the what is it, the plow. You fix the plow to the back of the animal. Ben shoras. Akarim imbitzurim v'nosun shomo anovim lefikafim ein habalam aleim yesh hefsed gadol she'ein derech hapoyim lochas al hakerem v'al hashorim, because the workers have no vested interest, so they don't care if the ox steps on the grapes or the plow goes off the center portion. Manhigim osam al gefonim v'halantias v'heim miskalkelim. They used to damage everything. The hasharim nismim v'nishmarim. So in other words, if you hire workers and those workers have no vested interest in doing the right job, of course, today, maybe it's a little bit different because they get paid a lot of money. They have to make sure they're doing the right thing. But basically, if you're not watching your workers, they'll not do the right thing, and you will lose a lot of money. So that's the basic point of it. So Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that if you're a balabas and you hire workers, make sure that you oversee them. So this is an interesting Gemara. Again, the Gemara is just giving us a derech eretz from Rabbi Yochanan as to how you should conduct yourself and not fritter away your Yerusha. Okay, so those are the golden nuggets from Rabbi Yochanan that the Gemara wants us to know.
I am starting to like Rabbi Yochanan.
Yeah, Rabbi Yochanan has a very good instinct, very good sense. Okay. Now, starting with the top of Lamed Amud Aleph, we're going back to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, "Sotcha l'tzarcha abelo l'chvodo," that if you find a garment, then what are you supposed to do? Besides shaking it, you're also supposed to sort of spread it out and make sure that, maybe that it doesn't form lines or folds or whatever it is to keep it smooth. Toshma, says the Gemara, come and listen a brisa. Sotcha l'tzarcha, we say that you have to smooth it out l'tzarcha, for its reason. Right, the Gemara l'tzarcha in. Or l'tzarcha, no. I'm sorry. Back up. Second line. The Gemara asks a kasha. Iboya lahu l'tzorcha mai. I'm sorry, we skipped that line. So you're telling me that you have to smooth it out. What happens if you, in the same motion, you're doing it for its benefit and for your benefit? L'tzorcho ma. What do? So he says, Toshma, I'll bring you a brisa, Sotcha l'tzorcha. It says Sotcha l'tzorcha. And we interpret l'tzorcha in, or l'tzorcha lo. In other words, so we want to learn from the brisa, because the brisa says that you smooth it out for its benefit. So if you're asking a kasha, what happens if you want to do it for your benefit and its benefit? Then the answer is you can't, because the brisa says Sotcha l'tzorcha, which means only for its benefit, but not for your benefit. That's how the Gemara wants to interpret it. Like the Gemara, Amos Sefer, the second half of that brisa, which is actually our Mishnah, Amos Sefer, avalo l'chvodo. But you can't, our Mishnah says you can't do it for your honor, for your benefit. In other words, it's a beautiful tapestry, and you have to, and you want to just hang it up so people can see how beautiful it is, and it has no benefit to the actual carpet itself. You're not allowed to do it. Avalo l'chvodo, l'chvodo hu delo holatzarcha u'letzorcho shapir damim. In other words, we're being very particular about the word. If the word says l'tzorcha, then we're saying it means only for its benefit, not for your benefit. If it says l'chvodo, you can't do it for your benefit, but what about for your benefit and the benefit of the item? Then l'chayre shapir damim. Then l'chayre he can, because we're extrapolating just from the word. And the word says l'chvodo, but it doesn't say l'chvodo l'chvoda. So, Frank the Gemara, l'chayre it's a stira. From the ratio, we see that you can only do it for the purpose of the item and not your purpose. But from the sefer, we see the chvodo that you can do it l'chvodo. You can't do it l'chvodo, but you can do it l'chvodo and l'chvoda. Says the Gemara, elamahai like on the Mishnah minute. So there's no raya from our Gemara, from our Mishnah, which way to go. In other words, we're trying to understand if you want to piggyback your use with the use of the item, is it okay? And we thought we could do it from our Mishnah. So the Gemara explains you can't do it from our Mishnah. From our Mishnah, you can't learn it out. Okay, fine. Toshma, another brisa. We're going to find it from another venue. Lo yishtana lo agabe mita lo agabe migud l'tzarcha. So we're going to have another example here, and the Gemara wants to say that if a person if a person finds the garment, lo yishtana lo agabi mita, he shouldn't spread it on the bed. In other words, he shouldn't spread it out on the bed, lo agabi mogod, or on a hook. So in other words, you shouldn't put it on a hook, or you shouldn't put it on the bed. L'tzorcho, for his purpose, Aval yishtena al gabi mita v'al gabi magid l'tzarcha. But you can put it on the bed or on the hook for its purpose. That's what the Brisa says. Nizdamnu lo orchim. Now, what happens if he invites guests to his house, right? And he needs to take care of this garment. Says the Brisa, lo yishtachena lo al gabi mita v'lo al gabi magid ben l'tzarcho ben l'tzarcha. So the chayra, it's a beferish Brisa. The Brisa says you shouldn't do it for your benefit, but you can do it for the benefit of the garment. But if you're going to invite guests, then you can't do it not for your benefit or the benefit of the guests. So isn't this a proof positive that when there's a double benefit, you're not allowed to do it, right? Because it says that if you're inviting guests, you can't put it on the hook or on the bed, even though it's for the benefit of the item. So you see, when you benefit as well, you're not allowed to do it. So the chayra, it's a beferish Brisa. Again, the Gemara is trying to give us a conclusion of what you're supposed to do if you will garner some benefit from the item as well. And for the Gemara Shana Hosam, no. The mikla kalale, very interesting answer, because by doing so, you will damage, you'll burn it. The mikla kalale, it comes from the word burning, that you will burn it. Why? Imishum eina, imishum ganvei. Very interesting that either because of eina means ayin hara, an ayin hara. You see the Gemara holds some ayin hara, or mishum ganvei. In other words, if you will spread it out, let's say it's a very expensive item, and you will spread it out, and people will come and look at it and admire it, then you could do damage. What kind of damage? Ayin hara, or someone will say, I've got to have that, and surreptitiously will try to steal it. So the Gemara is telling us something very interesting, is that in order to protect someone's find, you have to be conscious of the fact that if it's too nice, someone will damage it for you. And you see that ayin hara is a real thing. Rashi says over here, Nizdamalo orchim, kasal kedat of tama mishum the mischabed bahem dekel letzarcho. In other words, it'll be an honor for him to have this item sitting in his house. Shana hosam the kolale b'shtichazi sorfa, he'll burn it. Mahu sreifa. So what's the burning? What are you going to burn here? Imishum eina shetishlut bo ayin ra shel archim, that there will be an ayin hara. So the Gemara says ayin hara is a real thing. Imishum ganve pen yignevu ha'archim, because they'll see it so beautiful, so they'll make an attempt to steal it. It's a very interesting thing because again, he's talking here not necessarily only about outside people. He's even talking about other Jews, fellow Jews who come to his house. But he's saying, as a matter of course, don't play with fire, because someone may want to steal it from you, or an ayin hara, and therefore you're putting the find in jeopardy. Listen how far. You found something, you want to go ahead and preserve it, so you preserve it, but at the same time, you're reaping some benefit because it looks nice in your house. Says the Gemara, you can't bring a raya from here that you can do that because of the possibility of ayin hara or geneva. Again, a very interesting concept, maybe not one that we would really be thinking about. Okay, so the Gemara has one more example. Let's do this example. Toshma ichnisa lerivka v'dasha. So actually, we're going to introduce something here that I just want to touch on and understand this Gemara. Rashi talks about here about an egla rufa. We know what an egla rufa is. That if someone found a dead body, a person, between two cities, and we don't know who the murderer is, so the Torah tells us that there's a whole procedure about measuring the distance from the dead body to the city closest, and that city has the responsibility of burying him and bringing a carbon, whatever it happens to be, and the carbon is called an egla arufa, and an egla arufa is a young calf that has never had a yoke on it, meaning that it hasn't been worked. it's just a brand new calf, could be a year old or a year and a half old, but it's never had done any work. So the Gemara gives us a very interesting example here. Toshma, Ichnisa leRivka v'dasha. So Rashi says, to understand this, Ichnisa leRivka be'egla arufakoi. Rivka is kofli belaz shemedavkim sholosh behenos or arba v'tzavareim zu etzel zu v'dashim hadisha. So what they used to do is they used to take not just 2, but sometimes 3 or 4 animals, harness them together, and they would thresh the item that has to be threshed. In other words, it's a threshing floor, and the animals would go around and they would just step on it and step on it and step on it until it was completely threshed out. So here the Gemara is saying, what happens if you take a calf, which is not, it's a young calf, and you harness it to its mother as well as to other animals. For what purpose? So that it can suckle from its mother, because it still needs Yanika, it needs the milk of its mother. So you tie it to the mother, it suckles the milk, but it steps on the...
It's multitasking. It has to be near the mother, but you're using it at the same time.
Exactly.
But
So-
without putting a burden on it. There's no yoke.
not putting a burden, but the halacha of Egla Mufa is not just a burden, it's also working.
Working it, yeah.
So the question is this animal working? In other words, it's suckling from its mother, but it's stepping on the item that has to be threshed. Is it working? That's the shayla. So Tashma, Achnisa leRivka v'dasha kishera. It's not considered working because you don't have any direct benefit from that animal because you got 3 other animals doing the same thing. You don't need that little calf to be stepping on the grapes or on the wheat or whatever you're doing to thresh. You don't need that. So therefore, it's kosher. However, the shvil shetinik b'tadush psula. But if he directly puts it with the animal, with the other animals, says Rashi, the image of shvil shetinik b'tidush shahoisa imo dasha v'hichnis es habas the shem shechinik ba'afnis gavin shetadush psula. If you do it for the purpose of suckling and threshing, possible. If you do it for the purpose of suckling and it happens to be tied to other animals and it happens to step on other things, but that was not your intent, kosher. What does kosher mean? It's still an egla arufa. It's still an unused animal. But if you put it together with the intent of it,
Right, even if it was very little actual benefit, but
But
your
you-
intent was, I'll get 2 for the price of, I'll get more bang for my buck. Yeah,
right. Frank the Gemara, we have a Beferish Shariah now. You're questioning what happens if you double duty. You do it for its benefit and your benefit. We see that if you do it for its benefit and your benefit, it's possible. So we have a Beferish Shariah to our in other words, he wants to bring a raya from that brisa that l'tzorcha is, you can't do it, and you see it from this case. Emfrit the Gemara Shani Hossam the Oma Kra. We have a pasuk asher lo oved bo mikol makom. It says you can't do any work mikol makom under any circumstance mikol makom. So in other words. If it's Mikol Makom, now it takes it out of the realm of regular Tzorcha and Tzorcha because we have to be even more makbid. Like the Gemara Ihachi, if it says Mikol Makom Afilu Reisha Nami, then why do you allow it in the case of the incidental, right? Where you harness the baby and incidentally stepped on it? Why do you allow that? Because it says kosher, right? So then now the Gemara wants to go into another area, which is a little bit more complicated, and maybe we'll just hold off because it's going to be more complicated than that.
Rabbi, is this because the calf is considered a bachor?
It's considered no, not bechor. It's considered an unused animal, and you can only do an egla arufa with an unused animal. In other words, you have to have a pure, just like, and by the way,
Oh, okay.
we're going to have the same thing. The Gemara next week. We'll talk about it. Para aduma. What's a para aduma? The red heifer that we use for being mitame and being mitire. That too has to be a pure animal. And the Gemara there talks about the same conditions as it does for Egla Arufa, that if you use the animal, it becomes possible. But what happens if you're not actually using the animal, but it's incidental? So that's the kasha here on the Gemara. And the Gemara is saying, if you're going to say that it's incidental is okay, but if it's not incidental, then we have a raya to our Gemara. But if you're going to say the pasuk says you can't do it, then if you can't do it, why is an incidental use okay? It says mikol mako, meaning regardless of whether it's incidental or purposeful, you shouldn't be able to use it. So that's the Gemara's kasha. We'll stop here by the kasha, and because the answer requires much more depth. But you see that the Gemara is trying to reconcile whether tzorcho and tzorcha, what's the halacha? Are you allowed to use something for your benefit if it's piggybacking on the benefit of the item? And that, by the way, is an important question, not just in this Gemara, it applies to other Gemaras as well, is are you allowed to reap any kind of benefit from something that isn't yours? And then the question becomes, well, what's the benefit? What's the real benefit? So here we're saying that if someone was shaking it out, but at the same time, he put it on the wall because he wanted to shake it, but it looked nice on the wall. So people come into the house and say, oh, what a beautiful tapestry you have. He's having a benefit. Is he allowed to have a benefit from something that's not his, that he's just incidentally saving?
But we were saying that's no raya either, because there you had the intervening problem of ayin hara or geneva.
That's why he slugged it up, right?
Right.
But from this price, he's saying it's a good raya,
Right.
because you see that you can't double, you can't piggyback.
Right.
Okay, so that's the kasha, and we're going to hold off the teretz. We'll review the kasha again next week, because the teretz brings up a very interesting point, and we don't have as much time. But suffice it to say that from this very Gemara of just finding something and then using it, you see how the Gemara goes in depth and is so careful that one should not be over any lav, or one shouldn't do something improper, which in the normal course of events, and I think Jay, you raised it at the very beginning, what's the big deal? You find a Sefer Torah, you roll it, you read it, everybody benefits, everybody goes home, everybody's happy. That should be what you would think would be the way to go, says the Gemara. That's good in the normal course. But when you find something, you now have an intervening responsibility to protect it. And even though you're right, Jay, on the one hand, it doesn't lend itself to say, what, a person shouldn't do a mitzvah just because he finds an item? The teretz is, Shabbos Aveda, the guardian of an Aveda, has a big achrayus, and you are responsible to make sure that that Aveda is intact. And even though you're going to do a mitzvah with it, with that mitzvah may come damage. With that mitzvah may come damage, and therefore you have to weigh the mitzvah versus the damage to the original owner. And that's how fine and how careful our Chazal have been in terms of making us understand, the balancing test, that it isn't just a one-way street. Yeah, I find it, I use it, it's a mitzvah, everything good. No, there's intervening reasons to say you shouldn't do it. So anyway, it's a big machshava in the Gemara, but so we'll pick this up next week. Mitzvah Shem will continue on this.
Okay, thank you.
Shkaya.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Shkaya.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everyone.
Yep.
Well.